On behalf of the Intelligence Studies Project, the Strauss Center, welcome to today's program, Future of Intelligence Analysis. So before I introduce our guests, I did want to remind you of at least one of the upcoming events on our crowded national security schedule. I saw a number of you yesterday down in the Bass Lecture Hall for Dennis Ross's talk on the Middle East. And I wanted to draw your attention to at least one other event, and that's next Tuesday. We'll welcome back to Austin Ken Pollack of the American Enterprise Institute. Ken's going to be talking about his most recent book about Arab militaries, and I highly recommend him to you as one of the best informed and most insightful analysts on events in the Middle East. And I don't think it's a coincidence, tying it to today's topic, that Ken learned his craft as a junior analyst of Persian Gulf issues at the CIA and the Director of Intelligence. So come on out for that if you have a chance next Tuesday. Today we're honored to welcome, for the first time to Texas, I'm told, Joe Gartin. So over the recent holidays, Joe concluded a remarkable 34-year career with the CIA and the broader U.S. intelligence community. In his final assignment, Joe was the agency's Deputy Associate Director and Chief Learning Officer. And our poster, though, highlighted Joe's contributions as the Dean of CIA's Sherman Kent School for Intelligence Analysis. Joe also served as the Deputy Chairman of the National Intelligence Council. He's unquestionably one of the leading practitioners in this country on the discipline of intelligence analysis, and also a great student of that craft. So today we've asked Joe to lead a discussion with you all about the myriad challenges faced by intelligence analysts. So Joe's going to speak briefly, and then when he finishes up, he'll look forward to fielding your questions. He'll moderate them by himself. So please join me in welcoming Joe Gartin.
Those 34 years were powered by a lot of coffee, but I think it's perilous over here on the lectern, so I'm not going to put it here. So thanks for having me here today. I hope you all can hear me. I said earlier today I wore a bow tie so you could believe that I was actually from Washington, from Virginia. Thanks for having me here today. A couple of caveats probably are worth saying. I retired at the end of December, but I haven't yet quite fully broken the habit of saying we when I mean CIA. But I don't speak for the CIA. I'm a retired person. So if I slip into sort of what we're doing, I really mean what I did when I was at the CIA, and I'm not speaking for the CIA. And my comments are, of course, on the record and they're unclassified. So if you ask me questions that I don't think I can answer, I'm just going to point to Steve or Paul and let them violate their oath for keeping classified information classified. But I don't think we're going to have any trouble in that area. So I wanted to talk to you today about the future of intelligence analysis, and I will be mindful of the clock and not sort of overrun my allotted time and allow plenty of time for your questions. It's an issue that I've thought a lot about. In fact, as I was preparing last summer to sort of transition into private life, I put down on paper where I thought the craft of intelligence analysis was going. It was published in the Center for Studies of Intelligence, Journal Studies of Intelligence. And you can find it there, published last year. So remarks are drawn from there. I want to start first with sort of where we are. And for me, I think intelligence analysis is a field that really is at an inflection point. And this is an inflection point that affects lots of knowledge industries. It's not just intelligence, in fact, it's not principally intelligence. It's journalism, other forms of media, law, medicine, etc. All of these traditional industries that are, in a sense, run by experts are being buffeted by trends that exist throughout the U.S. and international economy. The rise of big data, artificial intelligence, etc. I still think of intelligence as a largely sort of intimate human endeavor, however, and or at least for the foreseeable future, I think that'll persist. But there are these winds that I think are affecting where we're going, and I want to talk to you about that. It's worth, I think, sort of starting at the beginning. I used to be as Steve said, the dean of the Sherman Kent School for Intelligence Analysis. It was created about 2000 by the CIA to provide a uniform set of training experiences for our brand new analysts. Prior to that, there really was no set training course. We had a few classes that existed occasionally, but it was really up to the individual to decide whether to take those classes. So we changed that in 2000. We named the school after Sherman Kent. So I used to ask every career analyst program, which ran about 12, 13 times a year, when I would meet with them, anybody know who Sherman Kent is? So I'm gonna ask that question here. Anybody know who Sherman Kent is? Right.
Shirley Temple?
What's that?
Shirley Temple? Is that
Sherman Kent.
Oh, Sherman.
Yeah, not Shirley Temple. Shirley Temple is more famous than Sherman Kent. So the number of hands here that you didn't see raised actually was exactly the same at the CIA. Right? We had named the school after a profoundly consequential individual in the development of analytic trade from Sherman Kent. And I think it's a good place to start, not because a lot of people don't know him, he's not a household name, but to sort of think about why Sherman Kent is so important to the craft of analysis. And as I said, he's not a household name, but he really set the standard. You might consider him maybe a sort of a founding father of intelligence analysis. Can't imagine what he called an elevated debate. That was, in his mind, the best, smartest people in the United States from the university systems, like he was a product of UC, Berkeley, and then Yale, engaged in a really serious endeavor, steeped in a profound understanding of the world, and working together to understand, explain, and predict the course of world events. More importantly, I think for our purposes today, it was Kent's writings and thinking and arguing about the fundamentals of analytic tradecraft. For us, that's things like probability, estimate of language, how we dissent with each other within the community, still underpin analysis today. They are really fundamentally timeless concepts, and he created many of them. And so I used to think, when I was at the National Intelligence Council as vice chairman, which is another place where Kent worked in his career, Board of National Estimates, if he came back today in 2020, would he recognize the job? And I think, and I thought then, that yes, in fact he would. He would sort of understand the basic contours of how we do analysis today. And that's because if I could summarize it into one particular phrase, Kent came up in an era in which intelligence analysis largely consisted of reading stuff and writing stuff. The job really was about reading stuff and writing stuff, reading intelligence reporting and turning that into analysis for a customer. And that's not necessarily a criticism of Kent and his peers, but I think we can also say that maybe some criticism is due. I mean, there are a number of critics that Kent had in his day and subsequently after his career. One particular failing of Sherman Kent in that era was a really infamous estimate done on Cuba, in which Kent and his colleagues concluded that the Soviet Union would not put strategic nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba. And he was, of course, catastrophically wrong. It's a famously wrong national intelligence estimate. And Kent's defense of it, I think, is quite memorable. He said, later he wrote about this in his memoirs, no estimating process can be expected to divine exactly when the enemy is about to make a dramatically wrong decision. We were not brought up to underestimate our enemies. I mean, in other words, Kent was arguing it wasn't the estimate that was wrong. the Soviets were wrong. And he maintained this line really until his death. And in fact, That's a fairly common defense within the U.S. intelligence community. Well, we didn't really quite get it wrong, we predicted it correctly, but they did something we hadn't expected, and they probably shouldn't have done. This is really the heart of Ken's argument. So if that was the only mistake, then I think we could have just taken Ken's defense at face value, but of course it isn't, right? I mean, I think all of you in the room here can think about intelligence mistakes and failures, some minor and some really significant. Some so significant that they have essentially entered into the popular lexicon of how we talk to each other about a rock WMD. If I say a rock WMD, it means something to many of you in the room about intelligence failure. Even if you don't know all the details, it stands for something, right? And for me, it fundamentally highlighted this transition from Ken to a period in which we recognize that just getting a lot of really smart people, who, by the way, all looked exactly like Sherman Kent, because he only hired men, and he only hired men like him, getting all the smart people together didn't necessarily turn out a better product. So where are we right now? And so I wanted to refer to, I think, a landmark book by Dr. Rob Johnston called Analytic Culture in the U.S. Intelligence Community. Written in 2005, it's a little bit dated, but I think it still captures for me sort of where I think we are in this inflection point that I mentioned earlier. So in 2005, Johnston wrote, "As it is now practiced, intelligence analysis is art, tradecraft, and science. There are specific tools and techniques to help perform the task, but in the end, it's left to individuals to use their best judgment in making decisions." So part of what I think Rob was getting at was, I tend to categorize as a style of analysis. It's a codification of the style of analysis. So what I mean by that, it's rules, logic, argumentation, evidence, but I think it's actually broader, and he unintentionally is getting at what I see, which is a sort of uniformity in prose and presentation. That is, a style of U.S. national level intelligence assessments falls into a fairly recognizable product. They're almost indistinguishable if you read something from the CIA or the Defense Intelligence Agency, the State Department. It doesn't really matter. The argumentation, the prose, the way an analyst presents her analysis to the policymaker is more or less the same, I think, across the community. And it's more than that. There's also kind of a uniformity, I think, in our approaches to hiring. Into analytic training, I mentioned the Kent School, the CAP program, which is replicated by the Defense Intelligence Agency in their own program, and most of the rest of the IC has programs like it to one extent or the other. Most of that content is in fact borrowed from the CIA. Editorial review, publication standards, graphics, maps, headlines. It's all kind of codified into a particular style, and has created what I think is, you might think of sort of a dominant analytic culture. And some of this has happened organically, and some of it I think was accelerated by the creation of the Director of National Intelligence 2005, which has sort of leveled the playing field in some respects within the U.S. intelligence community. Nonetheless, no culture is fully insulated from change. And I want to talk a little bit about what I think are 5 key drivers in change within the U.S. intelligence community. It's not limited to 5, maybe you have your own list, and I'd be happy to hear your points in a minute. But for me, these 5 key drivers, they happen more or less at the same time, but with sometimes constructively collective impact and sometimes discordant impacts. So these 5 key drivers for me. The first is the rise of structured analytic techniques. We could spend a lot of time on these, but this essentially was created really this sort of movement toward SATs, as we often refer them to, structured analytic techniques, was a way of counteracting biases in our thinking, to help inject self-conscious rigor in tumor analysis. Related, the second key driver for me was really advances in cognitive sciences in fields like behavioral economics. So this occurred really in the 1970s and 1980s, but we began to see its popular effect, I think, in the 2000s, especially on our field, that shed new light on how people make decisions and how poorly most of us actually do make decisions. The third key area for me was improvements in quantitative forecasting, quantitative approaches to forecasting, and I think this is best encapsulated for me, at least at a popular level, in Philip Tetlock's book on expert political judgment. When that book first came out several years ago, I tried to read it and I couldn't get through it, and I picked it up a couple years later and really understood the benefit from the work that I was doing at the Kent School, what Tetlock and his colleagues were getting at. And essentially what he argues is that if you're an expert, you're not any better at predicting the future than this room. With your varied expertise, if I might be an expert on intelligence analysis and I give you the sense of the future, collectively you can do as good a job as me in predicting that future. The fourth broad area for me is the rise of counterterrorism analysis. And I highlight this because counterterrorism analysis collection and operations since 2001 has had a really significant effect on analysis. And that's because it's hyper-specific, right? It's hyper-specific. If you want to know exactly where is Joe Gartin standing right now, in case you want to do something about Joe Gartin standing in this room. You want to know his cell phone number, his address, what kind of car he drives, where he buys his clothes, is it ties to a tie, or is it equivalent? I taught him. Of course. But the point is that it created, I think, a vast enterprise focused on really specific things, not on strategic analysis. And it has turned into an industry, I think, essentially of its own. And the last, and maybe perhaps the most important for the future piece for me, is really this explosion of data. It's increased the complexity of an analyst's job, but also potentially increased the fidelity of her assessments. So as in other knowledge industries, we talked about this at the beginning, taken together, I think that they're redrawing the contours of the analytic profession. And they've had this effect of democratizing the number of actors who are producing high quality assessments. In other words, if you're a senior policymaker, you rely on the Central Intelligence Agency and the other 16 or so agencies out there doing work like us or with us, but you have lots of other sources of information. Right? So, let me highlight maybe one of the things, is that you've got this, what I sort of regard as a dizzying variety of sub-disciplines within intelligence analysis. So in Kent's day, analysis was pretty strategic. During World War II, when he first joined, it could be specific. You want to know how high was the fence in Normandy, what the defense is like, what kind of tank are the Germans going to use, et cetera, et cetera. But when Kent is writing and doing most of his analysis, it's at a really strategic level. And there are disciplines that he did not anticipate then that we do today. Financial intelligence, identity intelligence, as I mentioned, counterintelligence. And so this is really important for us to keep in mind when we think about the future of intelligence, is that there isn't one kind of intelligence analysis anymore. That it's this broad field that encompasses a really broad variety of subdisciplines. So the last part I want to talk about is where are we building? And I could use your help here. When I wrote this article this fall, I thought it seemed kind of, as I tried to envision a future, I thought I was going to hit on some important themes. Even now I sort of look at it and I think, well, I feel a little bit like I'm writing about we're going to have flying cars or something. We've been waiting for this for a long time, and it hasn't happened yet. And the problem with doing predictions and forecasting is that you always have this risk that you're really just forecasting the present. A good example we mentioned, we were talking yesterday about, like if you think about your cell phone. So, my first cell phone, and there's some folks in the room who are we're of the same vintage, right? So you think about what did that first cell phone look like? Not just its physicality, its sort of physical nature of the phone, but what was it? It was a phone. Right? I mean, it was profoundly interesting that you could make a phone call from your car, and you could find your significant other, your work, no matter where you were, you could call them. I never, for a moment, thought when I had that brand new flip phone with the antenna you had to pull out, that it would really just be a computer or a camera. Right? I didn't think about that. So as we think about the future, this is a challenge for us. But let's try to put a human face on it and think about what does analysis look like in the future. Maybe we're out a decade or so. There's some really significant problems the intelligence community is going to have to solve. And that really gets around, for me, the issue of can you be secure in your mobile communications, and can you get off a hardwired network? We haven't really figured that piece out yet. Somebody will, eventually, probably. Figure out how to protect data in transit, as well as data at rest, but we're not there yet. But I thought if we had solved that problem, and our analyst, maybe he or she is sitting at home or they're on vacation, it doesn't really matter where, because we've solved that particular problem. Maybe analysts are still needed. I hope schools like this are still turning them out. I don't know how many we'll need in 10 or 15 years, that's probably up for debate. But essentially this analyst is aided by a digital assistant. Better than Siri or Alexa that you have today. A system that's really tracking data for her, that says, I'm looking for new developments, I'm synthesizing the data for you. Not only that, but it's got a better sense of how good are you at your job. Okay? It knows your past analytic calls. It knows the differences within the intelligence community. It knows where experts are that you don't know. It knows information you haven't seen yet. It knows information that has been recalled, canceled after it was published. It knows these things because you can't keep track of it anymore. Not with the vast amounts of information that are out there. And so it could say to the analyst something like, Steve, this morning, this event happened in Austin. The last time you wrote about politics in Austin, you said you were worried about capital flight, public sentiment, and inflation. Well, inflation is rising past the level that you said would be a problem. People in Austin are moving capital out of the city, moving it overseas, moving the money out of the city. Popular sentiment is decreasing. Popular support for the government is down. We can tell because your digital assistant, is tracking public sentiment, looking at all forms of media, more than you could ever do. You want to revise your assessment. You want to check yourself. And oh, by the way, your accuracy rating is now below 50%. Because I'm your digital assistant, and I just went back and looked at all your analysis. You're no better than flipping a coin right now. You want to try to improve that? Okay? So the digital assistant piece, I think, of the future of analysis isn't what we immediately think of. It's not the phone. It's not the cell phone. It's something else. It's something that evolves in a way we hadn't expected. Into a camera that destroys an entire compact camera segment within the economy, a phone that turns into a computer that knows everything about you, that tells you when you get in your car, how long it's going to take you to drive to the gym, because you always drive to the gym Saturday at 8:30. A system that assesses your own performance and tells you how to do it better. That to me is where I think we're gonna go. If I could say, what are my personal recommendations, and I'll turn it over to you for questions about, can we get to this future sooner than later? I mentioned the secure mobile problem, that's a really big one. But a few others I think are worth highlighting. The first is that we need to embrace data-driven analysis as an analysis. But they can't be two separate things. Right now in our industry, and this is true in other knowledge industries, data analysis is different than, let's say, mainstream analysis. Right? It's a side business. It's separate from what we do. Right? Those are the data people, but I'm the journalist. Those are the data people, but I'm the physician. Those are the data people, but I'm the aircraft safety engineer. Right? There can't be a gap. They have to be combined somehow. You can't combine all that talent, and generally speaking, into one individual person, but you can think about how you team talent better, more effectively, to answer these hard problems. Secondly, I think we really need to revisit our use of structured analytic techniques. There is no evidence that they, in fact, do anything. They don't necessarily deliver better assessments. And one of the key challenges for things like SATs is I can improve your cognitive ability in the thing that you're working on today. I can expose you to some piece of training. I can help you make a better assessment on that topic today. Later that afternoon, when you think about buying a car, you will not apply that same analytic rigor to that. But these skills, in fact, do not transfer from one domain to another. Not within the same person and not within organization. And you see this a lot in analysis, where you'll read a piece of work and you'll think, I wonder if the Austin analysts ever talked to the Houston analysts, because this problem looked like the problem that Houston had. And the Austin analysts, well, they're pretty sure of themselves, they know a lot about Austin, they're gonna say, look, we're not like Houston. We're not Houston. So really, I think assessing whether or not structured analytic techniques make a difference in ensuring that they do and trying to measure it seems really important to me. The third area for emphasis will be on tightening, shortening the feedback loop between policy and analysis. And Sherman Kent, not a household name, but Sherman Kent really argued for there needed to be a divide between analysis, intelligence analysis, and policy making. In Kent's day, it was kind of a patrician divide, I used to think of it as these very senior analysts would then deliver their goods to the policymaker and say, over to you, make a good decision. This has been a point of contention within the U.S. intelligence community probably for 70 years now. But we need to find a way to provide better and tighter, faster feedback on the quality. And I think the analogy in my mind is, you're doing this all the time right now, right? When you Google something and you look at a result and you pick that result, you're now one of 1 million people who pick that particular result, which means it's probably a better result. Finding ways to use the data about how the policymaker is engaging with the product that we're producing, feeding that back into our information processing cycle, so we're doing a better job. Which, by the way, doesn't mean that we're going to tell the policymaker what they want to hear. That's a line we don't want to cross. But we need to make sure that we're relevant, we're accurate, we're timely for what the policymaker needs. The fourth issue for me is related. It's something that we've struggled with too, is how do we measure and reward accuracy? Earlier today, we had a conversation about being wrong. And being wrong in the intelligence community is sort of the price of doing business. There's an argument in the intelligence community often that, and we're not the only domain like this, but that it's okay to be wrong for the right reason. This is a really common argument that, and usually it goes something like this. Like, I predicted that this bad thing was gonna happen in this particular country. It didn't happen because you did something about it, Mr. Policymaker, Mrs. Policymaker. You did something that altered the outcome I had predicted, and that's actually a good thing. So I can more or less go along with that argument. Sometimes the argument is, well, we were wrong, but that's because we made a bold call. I'm not so comfortable with that. Or sometimes it gets worse, we were wrong because we didn't know, we didn't see that piece of information, so we didn't share it with us. Had we known, we would have altered our assessment. Actually, our assessment was pretty close to what happened, if you just sort of ignored that one variable. So we start to explain ourselves. And by the way, you all do this too, right? I listen to a lot of sports radio. I mean, sports radio makes the intelligence community look like geniuses. Because that argument always goes something like that too. Well, I know the over-under was 52 points, and I thought it was going to be over, but I actually was kind of right because that last touchdown shouldn't have counted because the referee was there. So you start to explain yourselves. But I think we've got to find a way to measure and reward accuracy at the individual level as a way of improving performance. The last piece, and I think it's maybe most relevant for a place like UT Austin, is hiring, recruiting, developing, and retaining diverse talent. I mention this because, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion within the intelligence community, within the government, within lots of employers today. And some of that conversation really revolves around two things. One, we need different perspectives to do our job, this is true. And two, we want to represent and reflect the country that we are working hard to defend. Those are really good arguments. It's also true that diverse teams work better for one particular reason. They compete harder internally. They compete with each other. That homogeneous teams can be really good and really expert, but diverse teams, and you can divide that sort of diversity line however you feel like dividing it. It doesn't really matter. But when you have heterogeneous teams, they compete internally with each other at a level that exceeds what happens in a homogeneous team. And for a country like ours that faces such complicated, difficult intelligence and policy challenges, it's imperative that we continue to attract really the best and brightest in America who bring a really broad and diverse set of skills, because we're not going to live without it. I should stop. I'll stop now and take your questions. How's that? Sir.
Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation, which provokes about a zillion questions, but I'll limit myself to one, and that is about the diversity of intelligence agencies within the intelligence community. I'm not sure what we're up to, 17? I think it was 17 when I left the Office of Naval Intelligence. What's the future of that? Ben Sass was here last year saying that we need to get another agency to somehow coordinate an interagency process, and I look at that somewhat incredulously.
Yeah. Well, I won't comment on Ben Sass. I had the same reaction, by the way. There was a really good piece, on balance, a really good piece. Michael Morrell, former acting director, and Dean Seagart wrote, I think, for Foreign Affairs, in which they argued a few months ago that we needed another intelligence agency to focus on open source information. And there's a lot of merit in the overall argument. I'm not a fan of creating additional agencies. I think the fundamental challenge that you see, and this is what you're getting at, is that it goes back to something we talked about earlier. One, you have this explosion of data, and you have an explosion of specialties to cope with that data, and you have an explosion of disciplines to provide intelligence analysis out of the data. This is, like kind of a gigantic self-looking ice cream cone, which is not to minimize importance or impact, but it is to say that it's going to be really difficult to get your arms around all of it. What I think, sometimes, and I won't put words in your mouth, sometimes I think when we talk about the size of the intelligence community, we're talking about two different things, budgets and people. People are inexpensive. Technology is not. And can we find ways to be more efficient? Can we find ways to be smaller? Can we find ways to outsource that? Can we find ways to insource it with better technology? I don't have a good answer for you. That might be evident from that long preamble. I don't know that in the current era, and by that I sort of mean the next 10 years, can we reconstrain the size of that enterprise, intelligence enterprise? Because the data piece keeps growing. And then you throw money at data problems, with money comes programs and people. Maybe AI and machine learning can help solve that problem, but I'm not sure. Sir?
I was encouraged by the uniformity of prose and presentation on the front across all of those 17 intelligence agencies. But I'm curious about whether or not consumers of your intelligence share that understanding and share the common language that puts meaning, meaning behind those words, especially given that they can use estimative language in a way that
Right.
distorts this stuff to fit any number of explanations.
Is there a question in there?
Well, so the question is whether or not you think that how you can try and deal with that challenge, and whether or not you think there's a process for improving that
Okay. Thank you.
exchange.
So, you're articulating quite effectively that I wasn't trying to be humorous, asking exactly what the question was. Just wanted to make sure everyone could refine that a little bit. See, we're talking about two different problems. One of which I can't quite solve, which is on the policy side. The way I tend to think about that, and we'll get back to the first question. The second is, something I mentioned before today, which is there's a risk of hubris when we think about the intelligence community. There's an enormous risk of hubris, but sometimes masquerade as objectivity. Not the same thing, of course. But it can manifest itself when I think I'm being objective and answering the question that you're giving me. It's really because I think the question that you asked me is dumb, and I'm going to tell you what I think you should do. Does the policymaker understand the differences in the inputs? I think there's sort of two things buried in the question. One is, as you mentioned, sort of the presentation piece, and a colleague of mine who was at the National Security Council toward the end of the Obama administration had a good analogy, I thought, which was, if you're a busy policymaker at the NSC or an executive branch agency, and you think, look, I don't really care. You, the intelligence community, are like a candy machine. I'm going to press the button, and I want the candy bar to pop out. I don't care how it works. I don't care about the supply chain. I don't care about who made it. I don't care that you think your Milky Way is better than the other company's Milky Way. In fact, they're the same candy bar. Just give it to me. The second piece of that question is, though, do they recognize what it is that we're saying? And I think this is where sort of the feedback loop is. We need to be really careful, specific, and direct when we try to convey information, so that we're sharing a common understanding. When I say something is likely, very likely, not likely, probable, may, right? That these estimates, the words that we're using to convey confidence and probability are clear to the customer. And that is a sort of a double-sided equation, because the policymaker in some cases wants certainty, or they want enormous ambiguity, depending on what the policy course of action is. And the producing agency wants absolute certainty or enormous ambiguity, depending on their confidence in what they think is happening. That's kind of a toxic, to me, it's a toxic equation. And I really favor, this is not a universal view when I was in the intelligence community, I favor really specific language. And I also favor the use of percentages to convey probability. I like numbers rather than words, because we might disagree on what the words mean. How about, we're on the wall.
Can we go back to your question about the merger of digital analytical assistance and the human analyst? As AI gets more powerful, I can see your data analyst, your digital analyst, being able to identify blind spots in the human analyst. I'm feeding my person this data, and she either doesn't want to hear it or she's not seeing it. At what point does your digital analyst go over your head?
I think this is a really, really great question. And I can think of, let's think of an occasion where we want that to happen. And it's not quite artificial intelligence, but it's close. You think, well, it's sort of an autopilot system on an aircraft, right? If the pilot is doing something really stupid, you want the airplane to say, you are doing something really stupid, like you really need to do that. Stop, right? So the stick shakes, right? Are there other pilots in the room? Thank you, you all help me out here. You want systems that are gonna help prevent humans from making terrible mistakes. So I could definitely see that. The danger for me is we have, I think, a tendency, I think a well-documented tendency at this point, to trust algorithms more than we should. Right? To trust in the output of whatever it says on my phone. If I Google up some question, and I look at that first result, and I forget that it's sponsored, or maybe an ad, and I never page, right? I'm sure that professors in the room see this in their work. Right? So if I overtrust the algorithm and I don't know how it's built and I have no ability to reach inside that black box to test it, then maybe the aircraft prevents me from crashing into the ground, or maybe the biases that are baked into the algorithm actually just put the aircraft straight into the ground. And I don't know which that can be. But I definitely like where you're going with that question, which is, can it prevent us from making the mistakes that are most common to us and counteract the biases that we bring to it? I'm optimistic about it, but to me it feels really unproven yet. Sure.
Maybe a question in the same area. So issues around uncertainties or even unknowables. So making sure you're making a complex strategic decision with lots of data analysis and lots of information, but not missing or understanding the relevance of uncertainties or even unknowables, and making sure you understand that. How does that integrate in your thinking?
So how do I deal with uncertainty?
Yeah, uncertainties and unknowables, and making sure they're being, that if they may, what the probabilities are, and make sure they're not blind spots, because they're uncertain when we talk about them, or unknowables, we just put it over here, and it could have a very relevant impact on the actual strategic decision.
This is an area where I do think that structured analytic techniques can be useful because they are they're a scaffolding of cognitive assistance to help you make better sense of a complex situation and to identify your assumptions, to identify your gaps, to think about your confidence, to think about probability, risk, to think about unknowns and knowns. So for me, that's one piece, certainly. And then I'll come back to a point we were talking about earlier, which is I think that you need, not only do you need diverse teams with diverse levels of expertise and maybe sometimes diverse approaches to cognitive processes, you also have to build in systems that say it's okay for you to tell me I'm wrong, and for me to listen to you. And that has to occur really early in an analyst career. And it has to be reflected, I think, all the way to the top of the chain. For you to say, I think you're wrong, I think you're missing something, I think you should have thought about this. I think, those two pieces to me go together. We can maybe fix the cognitive bias problems, but if we don't also at the same time make sure that we're creating an environment in which you can actually speak truth to power and not just say it as a saying, you can actually do it. Those two things together will help address some of your problems. Sir?
Yes, you properly stress the importance and the practical value of identifying and recognizing error. How, underlying that statement is the premise of a commitment to intellectual honesty, which manifestly does not exist at a time when the United States intelligence agencies are being politicized, and in which the reward structures within those agencies are influenced by whether or not one has associated one's views with what the prevailing consensus is. I could give you examples, you know them better than I, mortgaging our future in the Middle East to unqualified alignment with the Saudi-led Sunni bloc, doing whatever Mr. Mohammed bin Salman suggests we do, leave aside Israel, and a number of other very sort of dubious foundation stones of our positions and policies in the region.
So I'm not going to try to address the litany of policy challenges that you just laid out. I will say that imperfect, yes, but in my personal direct experience, I have found that there has been a staunch defense of objectivity throughout administrations. And I joined under President Reagan and then served under every president, including President Trump. I found the workforce itself and the leadership of the workforce over the time of my 34 years to be increasingly focused on this issue of objectivity.
Of what?
Of objectivity. Increasingly attuned to it. The CIA has an ombudsman for objectivity. We do an annual survey within the U.S. intelligence community on this very topic. We report to Congress on it. I'm not going to say that it's going to satisfy all the concerns that you raised here. But I will tell you that in my dealings as an analytic manager, reviewing thousands, literally thousands of intelligence assessments, approving them personally for publication, that the workforce itself is your best guarantee. That doesn't mean that what happens in the sit room from a policy-making decision is an optimal outcome from an intelligence standpoint. But if you think about it as sort of one of many inputs into a process. Your real obligation is to protect internally what you can do and to convey the best information you can. Sir, Steve, I'm sorry, Steve?
No, go ahead.
I would take your comments one step further. Have you been able to, can you talk to us about any differences that the way the intelligence community operated under Trump than it operated under other presidents?
Let me answer it this way, which is, from my standpoint, particularly since the creation of the Director of National Intelligence in 2005, that the level of integration and collaboration within the U.S. intelligence community has increased steadily over that time period. And I have not seen a change or reduction in that collaboration, in that integration, in that cooperation over the last 15 years. That's been a really positive trend. I mean, I think about it in very simple terms, and I still have this habit, by the way, of reaching for my badge, and it's not there anymore. But just a simple thing, like when I first started, you couldn't get into a different agency building with your CIA badge. And your DIA badge wouldn't let you in the NSA, your NSA badge wouldn't let you in the NGA. It was like you were entering a foreign country and you needed a passport. Today you can walk into any building. Today you can discover information in ways that were not possible when I first started. The President's Daily Briefing today is under the OD9. In the OD9 era is a coordinated intelligence community product. When I first started, we never shared it, never coordinated it, ever. So I think we've moved in a positive direction. Steve.
Yeah, during your talk, Joe, thanks very much for this. You referred to what some academics and scholars refer to as the Sherman Kent versus the Bob Gates school, proximity versus distance from the policymaking consumer. And we teach that in our classes. It's a useful way to think about the business of providing intelligence support to policymakers. But is there really any debate anymore? Mike, given the number of analysts we now push forward with military elements, we send to embassies overseas, we detail to the National Security Council the rotational assignment obligations. Isn't this a historic anomaly? Haven't we sided with proximity, with closeness, with being embedded with our policy, knowing their concerns, serving their interests? Isn't this settled? Or do you think there's still some debate underway about, being out in your idyllic campus in Langley and never dealing with policymakers and throwing intelligence over the transom for them to use? It seems to me that doesn't exist, but I'd like to hear your view on it. That there's no debate is what I'm saying. We've sided one way or the other.
Yeah, if folks didn't hear the question, I'll just maybe counsel a little bit. It's just that, just like this, asking is there still a debate over the divide between policy and intelligence analysis? Or let's just say intelligence broadly. And that is in fact an age-old debate, what goes back to Sherman Kent, who's contemporary William Langer, and you can look it up on Wikipedia. I will belabor the point. But it has been a fundamental question within the intelligence community. Here's kind of where I think we are, which is I would say, yes, I think the way you characterize it is correct, that this tight integration of intelligence with policy is essentially a decided question. However, there is, I think, still a bright line between informing policy and making policy. And if you step over the bright line, and sometimes you might, especially if you're the director of an agency or the director of national intelligence, you are stepping over that bright line knowingly. You're stepping into a territory when the policymaker says, okay, you told me all these things are happening in Austin, what do I do about it? This is how the question is usually posed, right? What do you want me to do about it? And there, I think the obligation is to remain objective, but provide options. Right? Especially for the CIA, which is uniquely, speaking to all of you here probably know this, but it's worth saying out loud, right? It's uniquely not a cabinet organization, doesn't respond to some other department within the U.S. government, and it has multiple roles: analysis, collection, covert action, counterintelligence. So it has a policy effect role as well as a policy information role. Does that answer your question, I think? I think it's a settled issue, but I do believe that there's still that bright line that shines through the middle of the room.
And you even went further in describing one of the safeguards that's been put in place, and that's this honoring of objectivity and giving people a place to appeal. So if we're gonna have our analytic community embedded with our policy community, we have to be policing very diligently.
Yeah,
Right? Yeah.
sure.
Thank you. I was particularly interested in your comment on the need to shorten the feedback loop between policymakers and intelligence folks. I am a policy person who dabbles in cyber, and I sat down earlier this week with some students who are cyber in the more technical sense, and there were parts of the conversation where we may as well have been speaking different languages.
Right.
So I'd love to hear your recommendations for how we might educate and train intelligence folks who can code switch, if you will, between the technical aspects and the policy speak. And second of all, I'd be interested to hear if you think if there are any trade-offs with that, if we run the risk of losing some important nuance in that conversation.
Thank you for that. So, I will say this is kind of on the one hand and on the other hand. On the positive side, I think that, as Steve just mentioned, you have processes within the intelligence community in which analysts, typically analysts, but not always, can work in policy organizations as seconded employees, right? And that is a really constructive way to help inform them about the policy piece. The other hand is that the reverse is not true, right? That policymakers do not work, do not typically come to intelligence community organizations and say, I want to be an analyst for 2 years. It just doesn't happen. It does create an opportunity, maybe even an obligation for the intelligence community to think about how can it best inform its customers about what we can do and what we can't do. What are our capabilities, what are our limitations? To take that further to the other part of your question, I think is, in terms of speaking the common language, I think one of the issues that we dealt with at the Kent School in the last time that I was there at the Kent School in 2015, 2017 was a recognition that we needed analysts to be able to speak a different kind of language. That the majority of people that we hired were coming from, not all, but let's say a majority are coming from regional studies, security studies, intelligence studies, foreign language, etc. In other words, kind of a liberal arts education. Again, not uniformly, but significantly. And now I needed them to speak a different kind of language, a language of data, a language of numeracy, and to understand how data could help them do their jobs better. At the same time, we're hiring data scientists from Georgia Tech or some school, A&M maybe, wherever, and I need them to understand what it is that they're here to do, like how to inform, use their skills to inform. We can do that through training, but I think it's really an experiential process in which you can team people together to tackle hard problems. And sort of, I won't go too far down this sort of HR talent piece, but to me it does speak to the need for a much more agile way of employing individuals so that they can move seamlessly across the organization, yet still advance in the organization. So you can say, I want to work on this project for 6 months, but next month I'm going to go, and that's then I'm going to go over here. And you have more of a talent marketplace, maybe more of an IBM or Google model, and you say, hey, I'm running this really interesting program, and I'm looking for 15 people who want to come work for me for 3 months. And I need 5 of these, 5 of these, and 5 of these. Good, sir.
Given the rise of misinformation and fake news, how do you think this has impacted the nature of intelligence gathering and analysis? And do you think that this has impacted how American or the general public's view of the intelligence community in a general sense?
So the question was about how is, let's just say, fake news impacted both the intelligence community and then how the U.S. public views the intelligence community. You know, I don't think I have enough data to speak authoritatively to the second piece. From the standpoint of my data are anecdotal. So I think it's maybe a little bit hard to sort of draw a large lessons about large conclusions about how the U.S. public looks at intelligence. I mean, if you're in a democracy, you should be skeptical about everything that they're telling you. I mean, this is the very nature of a democracy, and you should be skeptical and ask hard questions of what your intelligence community is telling you. Keeping secrets in a democracy is not a right of the CIA, it's a power gifted to us by the American public in democracy. I think it's fair to say that we are in a period in which all voices of authority are questioned more routinely than they might have been in other periods. But this is also kind of a sine wave problem within the U.S. polity, I think, that might be sort of unique to this period. Maybe it's more at a higher peak than it has been in, say, recent years, but it's not the first time it's ever happened. So your other question was about how does it affect our job, how we do our business. You know, I think probably pretty profoundly. The upside for me is that we hire really skeptical people. Are there any Army veterans in the room? Okay. So one of my first managers, a guy named Gartin Gordon had been a ranger instructor before he became a team chief, first line supervisor at the CIA. And I got to know him really well over the years, and I asked him a question one time, like, so what's the difference being a team chief at the CIA versus being a ranger instructor, Army ranger instructor? And he said, Joe, I can get an 18-year-old boy to do anything. If I tell him to jump out of an airplane, he will jump out of an airplane. If I tell you to jump out of an airplane, you're going to say, what kind of airplane? Why am I jumping out of an airplane? How high is the airplane? What is the purpose of this jumping? Is there another way to achieve the outcome? It's like managing the CIA workforce is just a pain in the 18-year-old boy, anything. I used to be 18, trust me, this is true, right? So, we hire really skeptical people, and it can be frustrating. I can attest to that for sure. But that power of skepticism can be a really powerful tool. And it's one I think that we try to impart, I certainly try to impart to my family. I recently sent an email to my family members after some bad thing had happened somewhere. And I said, look, family members, and I know there's a range of views in our family. I come from, maybe like some of you, I come from a federal and military family. Father-in-law, brother-in-law, dad, wife, child, etc. One form or the other has chosen some kind of federal service. But there's a spectrum of views. And I said, I want you to do something for me, please. Before you like and forward, retweet, send to your friends that funny meme, either opposing this or supporting this, stop. And ask yourself, who is benefiting from what you are doing? Think, who has an interest in you doing this? Just think about it for a second. I'm not telling you what to think, but I'm asking you to think about how you're thinking and what you're doing. So we hire a skeptical workforce, I think is our best defense. Paul, I'm going to go here. Another Paul.
Yeah.
Sir.
Sir, just based upon the 5 drivers of change, I'm curious how you view those from the perspective of our allies' intelligence communities, and then also our adversaries, and how that may change or challenge some of those relationships.
On the allied piece, I'll say that I think we've got profoundly productive and important relationship with key partners around the world. All of them bring this, at the risk of sounding like a canned answer, but I think it is still the right answer. All of whom bring unique skills and capabilities to the program, few of whom bring the total package of skills that the U.S. can bring to bear. And most of you in the room could kind of name the top 2 or 3 services that you'd like to work with if you were at the CIA. our adversaries, well, they have some advantages. And the advantages can be lack of a US Constitution. I mean, they've got the ability to do things that we would find repellent and potentially illegal. There are much blurrier lines between private enterprise and government enterprise. And there are significant levels of coercion that Beijing or Moscow and other states can apply to private companies to assist them. I can ask a company here, and you can say no. They don't have to ask in the same way. Right? Where I think, but built into that is, and I hope this goes back to the advantage piece for us, is when you can leverage, I'm going to say, a free and capitalist, market-oriented, free speech society to deliver the tools and capabilities that you need, you will have a better outcome ultimately. But in the short term, they're faster, and maybe sometimes better than we are. And we do need to get out, and I think you've heard certainly senior leaders in the intelligence community speak publicly about this. We've got to keep up and get a step ahead of where our adversaries are doing, what they're doing. That we can't react, as we did, I think, in 2016, when we realized what was happening with the Russians in election interference. We realized it, we didn't anticipate it.
Oh, yeah, so before I ask my question, I'll just say, I hired Gartin Welch, and he was actually a pain in the ass to manage. He's a good guy, he's a really good guy. So I held this to the end because, but you, in your talk, you invited us to give you some comments on your comments about the future. And I found that to be a really interesting article. I assigned it to my students, and there's a lot of parts of it that I'm gonna go back and study and reread and use again. But in the kind of going forward, I would like to make a suggestion as you think about this, and that is that I think you're getting caught in the trap of evaluating. I don't agree with trying to just zero in on the rightness or the wrongness of our analysis. I think you have to look at the whole national security enterprise. You have to look at the role of a policymaker. First of all, very few single analysts do anything. It's teams of analysts, and then that may be conveyed by a PD briefer or somebody else. And so, you know, what I'm trying to get at is that sometimes we're right and we are believed and good policy is made, and we don't get a lot of credit for that because that's the way it's supposed to work, and that's, you know, that's great. Sometimes we're dead wrong and we're believed and action is taken, and then you have an Iraq war, and that's really bad, and we do a lot of studies about that. But most of the time, what we're trying to achieve is helping the policymaker understand what forces are at play and to position themselves better for that. And a lot of times you don't have a dramatic right and wrong, and you don't have a dramatic action that comes out of that. But sometimes you can really tell you're succeeding. The historical example I would just give you real quick to ground it is Patton's intelligence officer during World War II in the Battle of Bulge, and he says, I don't know what those guys are gonna do, but I'm worried about them, they're on our flank, and they're the only, you know, military unit that prepares for that and kind of saves the bacon because they had just thought about it. So how do you look at the broader enterprise and evaluate that and the intelligence process within that? And shouldn't that be a big part of what we're trying to, I like the idea of more systematically evaluating our performance, but I think it has to be the performance in terms of influencing policy, not just rightness and wrongness. What do you think?
So thank you for that opportunity to maybe expand on a comment that I didn't in my statement here today. I think part of what you're getting at, Paul's getting at, is what I tend to think of as sense making. Sense making is what we do the most of in the analytic community. I'm explaining to you what happened. I'm an expert. This thing happened. I'm going to tell you why it happened. I'm going to tell you what I think might happen next and what it means to the United States. That's the standard formula for virtually every intelligence analytic paper I've ever read. And most sense making is not that much different than, reading or watching TV after the Super Bowl and sort of reading why this team won, this team lost. It's important because, in fact, most of the time, we're not making predictions in the intelligence community. It's a fairly narrow subset. In fact, we're making fewer predictions than we actually think. We thought sometimes we were making predictions, but when you go back and look at the language, it's not clear. It's vague, it's general, could be anything, we're hedging. I'm using terms that weren't clear to me as a writer, maybe, or to you as a reader. In terms of evaluating the overall performance of the national security enterprise, good luck.
I mean, subsets of that, like individual questions,
Yeah.
Case studies maybe of how the intel affected. Nick Rasmussen is gonna come here and talk to my class, and one of the things he does is he talks about not the intel leading up to the the decision to go after bin Laden, but the way the intel was received at the White House and by the NSC. It's really interesting to look at it from that perspective, and what the frustrations were, what the questions were. That kind of thing is what I'm getting at, but it's more than the rightness or wrongness of the analyst. It's whether they were persuasive.
Yes, no, absolutely, absolutely. I like where you're going, and I would definitely agree on the need for consistent, continuous self-evaluation that doesn't turn into a self-criticism session. Like it's a learning process in which you're improving your performance by understanding what you did right or wrong, or whether maybe sort of in between. Building in those processes, I think, is really important. We have the Center for the Study of Intelligence, which is certainly one aspect of it. We have lessons learned program. I would say that the uniformed services are much better at this than other parts of the government, including the intelligence community.
So let's have maybe one more question. We're
Yeah.
gonna get people onto class.
Sir?
Picking up on your expressed preferences for numbers, to what extent is quantitative risk analysis being employed in decision-making in which for a certain possible event, you don't have a single probability, but a range of probabilities, which may lead to a second stage of events, maybe 2 or 3, and trying to assess reasonable ranges of probabilities, even perhaps including some Monte Carlo sampling, techniques and everything. To what extent is that being used in decision making?
I'm going to give you an "it depends" answer. Maybe the folks in the room would want to jump in and correct if I'm getting this wrong. I think it depends. To me, it's most prevalent in areas in which you are in a data-rich environment and in which you are dealing with professionals who are used to the kind of modeling that you're talking about, and have a customer set that is itself accustomed to doing that. So I think about something like coronavirus, and you have health professionals and pandemic experts, et cetera, who are used to dealing with that kind of data set and that kind of modeling to say, under these kind of circumstances, we get X, Y, or Z outcomes. I think it probably falls apart when we get into political forecasting, which is not to say it can't be done, but you actually have a problem both not only on the practitioner side, but on the sort of customer client side, in which the customer, the policy consumer at this point, might say, I don't really understand what you're trying to do with that Monte Carlo modeling that you're telling me about, but actually I think Steve's going to win the election because I know. So that's the challenge to me. I think when you have, and I suspect I'm telling you something that you know, but when you've got data-rich environments and a data-savvy customer set, you do better. And when you don't, you're going to do worse. It's harder.
Let's thank you.